welcome. I am so happy to be here today with my esteemed guests, Dr. Alec Dinnin, visiting instructor in political theory at the University of South Florida, and Dr. Mauro Carracioli, assistant professor of political science at Virginia Tech. And I have to say right here at the outset that before these two cats were fancy doctors with fancy titles at fancy institutions, they were my comrades and compatriots in the political theory program at the University of Florida, where we came up through the ranks together. And it is such a delight to be able to be kind of on the other side of that experience with you too. And we're here to talk about Jean Jacques Rousseau and the political thought of Rousseau. And correct me if I'm mistaken, were we all teaching assistants for Dr. Dan O'Neill's Introduction to Political Thought course at the University of Florida?
Indeed, yes.
So we all, probably, if I may be so presumptuous, maybe the first time we taught Rousseau to undergraduate students was in this capacity, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah?
Yeah.
That's really, really crazy. Like, what we should do the next time when we're finally all able to like be together and be like drinking and walking down memory lane is we should, if we have our notes from when we were TAs in that class, we should like put them side by side and
That's
see.
a great idea. I did what you said we shouldn't do, and I did go over and prepare, or at least think through things. And I completely forgot that of course I must have had my intro to political theory notes with Dan somewhere here.
Yeah, I think I have mine actually, like right next to me.
Oh, really?
But I'm not going to dig through it. They're in this drawer here, and like that drawer is treacherous. If I open it, it could just, everything could come out at once.
It's a Pandora's box.
Yeah, I'm not going to do it. But I think I do have it. They're handwritten, completely illegible, incomprehensible. They are notes from O'Neill's class. Yeah.
Well, that's like a delight that we all have that kind of shared experience and muscle memory with Rousseau. So, my first question, I'm just curious, when was the first time you read Rousseau? And what do you remember about that experience?
We're going alphabetically, so I'll go first. So the first time I read Rousseau would have been in a class at University of Nebraska at Omaha with a professor named Carson Holloway, who hails from a very different part of political theory than Dan O'Neill does at the University of Florida. And he taught the Discourse on the arts and sciences, and he also taught the second discourse on the origin of inequality. Didn't, I don't think, do anything on social contract. But yeah, this would have been 2010 or so, right? So yeah, that would have been with him. And I think that was the first text we read in this class of late modern political theories, was Rousseau, Burke, Mill, and Nietzsche. It was wonderful. Yeah.
How about you, Dr. Carracioli?
So yeah, my experience was that I read Rousseau for the first time as an undergraduate. But one of my memories of that time is that I took, I think, only one political theory class proper as an undergraduate. Most of my courses were either in the history of philosophy or in the international relations curriculum. So I double majored in that at Florida International University. And we had this really great course in the international relations department. There's a kind of a Plato to NATO course for IR majors. It was called Development of International Relations Thought. And this was sort of the reader, right? It's this kind of, roach killer type of a text with just sort of like little excerpts of the canon as interpreted by the editors to apply to, relevant themes and questions in international relations. And so the first time I read Rousseau was in that class. We had a small excerpt from the Art of War. And so again, at the time, right, it wouldn't make any difference to me, in terms of like what that kind of connection was. And the professor, who himself was trained as a political theorist, Harry Gould, who's still there at FIU, he would sort of make asides about kind of Rousseau's personality and like his eclectic biography. And it didn't really resonate, right? Because as undergraduates, we're only reading this very, very specific kind of bit of text. And so that stuck with me as to like, who was this cat, right? Jean Jacques. And I think later on, by the time I did arrive at Florida, and it was in Dan O'Neill's Introduction to Political Theory class where we actually read and I have that copy of the
Oh,
text,
that's
right?
great.
Yeah.
The everyman.
Yeah, it was then that it's sort of like, whoa, not only do IR kind of political theorists have such a very reduced and selective kind of reading of the canon, as we would call it, but that Rousseau himself poses so many problems as well. And maybe that's why some people only read him in a very limited sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. What a cool kind of context to meet Rousseau in. All right, so my first,
I have one thing to
Yeah.
add real quick, because my experience of reading him was in undergrad. I was really struck by the sheer audacity of the Discourses on the Origin of Inequality, and just the way that Rousseau undertakes to try to tell like a history of like human beings in the space of like, 30 pages in part one of that. I mean, part two as well, but I was just blown away by that, and I was totally carried away by it as well. Just the clarity of the narrative, and the kind of again, the bravery in some ways, the kind of absurd bravery to try to even undertake such a task, I thought was just mind blowing. And that was something as an undergrad that really stuck out to me and kind of inspired me in a way. It's like, that's what political theory is. I get to read how these really brilliant people tried to narrate the entirety of human history. Like, I'm going to learn a lot of interesting things. And I think you really still do with Rousseau. I guess we'll talk more about that.
and it does, the way he writes, there's such, and I don't know if this is like affected or if this is like really like, but it seems like the words are just sort of overflowing out of him. Like there's just this immediacy, like he is there, stream of consciousness, like he's posting, So yeah, I think Rousseau really grabs you and reels you in that way.
Yeah.
So my first kind of substantive question, Rousseau, as Mauro's comments intimated already, is famous for his paradoxes. And he himself, I think of him as a kind of paradox in the flesh. So, I've just got a few quick examples of this kind of paradoxical nature of Rousseau. So his body is very famously interred in the Pantheon in Paris alongside, great Enlightenment luminaries like Voltaire. And yet he was a great romantic, right? One of the kind of earliest, participants in this intellectual current we call the counter-enlightenment. He was in many ways at odds with, a rationalist like Voltaire. He also hated Paris, kind of famously, right? Paris to him symbolized everything he thought was wrong and corrupt in modern society. And yet here he is, at the end of his life, interred in the Pantheon, right? In his various writings, we get some of this in what we've read for this class in the second discourse, the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. He condemns the corrupting influence of, the modern arts like the theater and opera and dance, right? He thinks the whole beginning of the end for natural man is when we gather around fires and begin dancing together, right? That's where amour propre has its sort of origins. So, he has these scathing critiques of these aspects of culture. And yet he himself was at one point a dance master, a dance instructor. He taught dance. He was a great composer. He composed an opera that was, critically acclaimed and very popular and made him the toast of the town for a while in Paris. But he publicly opposed, building a theater in his hometown of Geneva, right? So he's sort of all over the place. Mary Wollstonecraft, who we'll read later in this course, she was a great admirer, but also a great trenchant critic of Rousseau. She described herself as sort of half in love with him. And I'm like, of course, how could you be fully in love with him? Because he is everything and its opposite, right? So you can only love half, right? So he's renowned, notorious for these contradictions, these paradoxes. So my question is, what's your favorite of these kind of Rousseauist paradoxes?
I think we're not going alphabetical anymore, so I'll
Okay, I'll jump in for this one. So I have to say from the outset that in my own teaching, and I don't teach Rousseau in an introductory setting, but I've taught him several times now in my version of sort of the moderns, right? Kind of your late modern political theory, right? From kind of the Machiavellian moment or the encounter with the New World to, kind of late modern Nietzschean thought or something like that. And I always place him as part of these distinct languages of modernity, right? The way at least I frame it to my students is that what we see in this period of about 300 years are very distinct and very, very intentional efforts to create new vocabularies, because there's something in the ether or in the context of what these thinkers are living through that the current vocabulary of the time is just insufficient. And so a lot of what you were describing, Lorna, in kind of the effervescence and the explosion of words and what Alec described as this irreverence is so central to so many of these thinkers that you feel very compelled, obviously, to place someone like Rousseau into that kind of genre or lineup of figures. And at the same time, he resists, right, constantly being kind of put into a box of any sort whatsoever, right? So even to think of Rousseau's works as expressing different languages of modernity is problematic, because there is very little to actually piece it together other than the fact that they reside in this kind of Swiss, you know, this citizen of Geneva who has all of these frustrations kind of pent up inside of him. And so when I present them to my students, I very much start with that paradox, right? Like that there are at least two different Rousseaus at work here. You have Rousseau as the patron saint of the Enlightenment, right? This figure who rejects traditional empiricism in the sense of what Alec was describing, of wanting to go back to origins, wanting to look beyond kind of the norms and customs of the age. And then you have this forerunner, as you said, Lorna, of Romanticism, right? This thinker of the sensuous, right? This thinker of aesthetics, right? Who obviously, in that kind of countercurrent to the norms of the time, you know, earns that distinction from Edmund Burke, calling him, right, the insane Socrates of the General Assembly, right? Like, you know, again, it's this Wollstonecraftian.
That would be his Twitter bio.
That's right. It's this Wollstonecraftian moment, right? Of like, yeah, I love him, but at the same time, like, I don't want to hang out with him, right? Like, I wouldn't want to hang out with him, given everything that we know about kind of
certainly not in dark alleys.
His biography.
Don't look it up. What do you get? Don't look it up.
Now you're gonna have to talk about it. And so,
yeah.
my favorite paradox is, though, that paradox, right, of like, the bon vivant, right, the free spirit, who at the same time is such a critic of European social baggage, right? Like, here you have the reluctant, almost like the reluctant academic, right? Like the person who, you know, clearly can't commit themselves to doing anything else in terms of the normal expectations of a kind of a bourgeois citizen in the 1700s. And at the same time, perhaps inadvertently, he becomes like the quintessential Enlightenment philosophe, right? Like, who, I don't know, not very few of us sort of regard them, just given the distance, as being kind of, you know, eccentrics in some way, but they were. And Rousseau, in that sense, is both very much like his compatriots in the Enlightenment, in that they were bucking trends and norms, but he clearly just felt so disaffected from all of that too, as at least something that would fulfill him. And so I present that to my students very much as part of the paradox of kind of higher education, right? Like, we all do this for various reasons, some for social mobility, some for enlightenment, and yet the strictures of the institutions are so contrary to the spirit sometimes that, you know, the hard thing is knowing how to navigate that back and forth.
Yeah, I think like you get a lot of this too in people responding to Rousseau. I'm just trying my hand. Like Burke, like Joseph de Maistre, the way that they respond to him, they almost kind of just laminate him onto the Enlightenment and sort of use him as their whipping boy, right? But then you also get in Mill, he refers to Rousseau and saying that his words or his thoughts exploded like bombshells in the midst of these people, the Enlightenment philosophers, right? So there is this kind of like strange tension in the way that he is read and interpreted and what he represents subsequently too. And by the way, also just by way of just kind of an aside, I think you can really tell the merit of someone by who his enemies are, or in the history of political thought. And Rousseau has like enemies on all, they're all the evil villains of the history of political thought are all the ones who hate Rousseau, mostly anyway. So anyway, yeah.
Some of the villains love him. I feel obliged to say.
Some of the villains love him? Like which ones?
Well, I'm thinking of Robespierre and his guillotine.
Yeah, that could be true as well.
I'm not sure if I'm ready to not call him a villain, although.
Yeah, Robespierre's got his problems. Yeah, so anyway, yeah, I had a couple of different ones, but I was just name a few and then I'll develop one. So one of them I think is that for me, and Lauren, I think you mentioned that it's like dances around the fire. That's where the egocentrism or the amour propre is born. I also think that there's a suggestion in that same section where it's actually like love that's the source of egocentrism and is the source of amour propre. And that, I think, is a really interesting paradox. I think there's also a suggestion roughly around the same part of the second Origins of Inequality, where he speaks of technology and technological development as perhaps unleashing this dramatic increase in human hardship rather than like making people's lives easier. It makes them horrific and is kind of the source of misery in many ways, alongside, of course,
creates these false needs, right?
For sure. Yeah. And later on, sort of the social contract, there's this notion of democracy as depending in some way upon slavery. And that comes through, I think, in Rousseau's own positions, although I don't know if you quite see it clearly in these two texts. If you're supposing you're only reading Origins of Inequality and Social Contract, you do see it elsewhere. But the one that I was going to focus on was this, I think, it's not an idea that's really specific to Rousseau per se, but it is one that I find he is especially well illustrated in the Social Contract, and that is the idea that freedom requires a profound level of discipline. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, there's this really, I know I don't want to get into the quotes yet, but I really have to do this. So there's a great quote for me. It's on, well, I won't give you the page number, that would be kind of useless. But in my edition of it, it's chapter 6, I think, of book 2. Okay. Or no, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong spot here. Hold on. It's chapter 8 of book 2 of the Social
Everyone
Contract.
Follow along in your hymnals.
Yes, in your hymnals, please do. Yeah, so this is the part where he's actually talking here about the lawgiver, which is in itself a paradox. So you have this whole idea in the social contract of, we have this like radically participatory democracy in which everyone's supposed to vote, all people are equal and all this, everyone has an equal say in what happens as far as the legislative assembly is concerned. But then, where are we going to get laws from? From a lawgiver. From a singular individual who arises like some kind of heroic, mythical, almost godlike character from who knows where.
Yeah, Moses seems to be the template, right?
Yeah. Perhaps so. Yeah. Well, so here's what goes on here in this section. Rousseau's talking about how the lawgiver is going to decide what sorts of laws to give to certain peoples, and he says, peoples differ. One is amenable to a discipline from the beginning, another is not, even after 10 centuries. The Russians will never be effectively governed because the attempt to govern them was made too early. Peter the Great had the talent of a copyist. He had no true genius, which is creative and makes everything from nothing. Some of the things he did were sound, most were misguided. This is the part I love. He saw that his people were uncivilized, but he did not see that it was unready for government. He sought to civilize his subjects when he ought rather to have drilled them. Right? Now, what's that to say? He's saying that, so these people weren't ready for freedom. They had to be disciplined first. If you go in there like Peter the Great and you try to give a bunch of Neanderthals libraries, it's not going to go well. They're going to burn them down, right? What you have to do rather is kind of crush the unruly spirits out of them. And then after they've been like smashed and smothered into some kind of obedient pulp, then you can actually govern in some way in which, we have some freedom obtaining, right? So you have to have this profound level of discipline, according to Rousseau, in order to have a freedom of a democratic sort. So I think that to me is a really fascinating paradox that comes through, especially comes through in Social Contract.
Yeah, and what that passage I think brings out too, not only that freedom requires an extraordinary amount of discipline, but that this vision Rousseau has of a political order that reconciles liberty with authority is not obtainable by just anyone, anywhere, anytime, right? It is a sort of rare phenomenon that requires kind of precise conditions, and it's not universalizable, right? In the way that maybe we think of, some of the other political utopias that we encounter in even in modern political thought. So, Rousseau, he seems to think that it is like for the Swiss canton, right? Mm-hmm. And doesn't work in many other places. And Rousseau himself, right? He even he gets called upon, at one point to help to provide input into drafting a constitution for Corsica, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of political theory articles that have been published, kind of auditing his handiwork there on that actual constitution for an actual people in an actual place against the kind of political theory laid out in the social contract, and it deviates from it, right? So,
talk about paradoxes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, let me jump forward to my next question here. So we're reading the second discourse, the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. They've read that this week, and now next week they're going to be moving into the social contract. What do you make of the relationship between these two texts? Because my hunch is that a lot of my students will find that quite a jarring transition, right? They will have encountered this kind of narrative of the original compact that forms society in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, which is basically, Rousseau thinks, is a kind of hoodwink or swindle of the poor and less powerful by the strong, right? It is a kind of institutionalization of the principle of might makes right, and he thinks it's unjust and corrupt and bad. And then all of a sudden they're getting a depiction of the social contract like this. So how do you make sense of the relationship between these two texts?
Yeah, so that's a really tough question. I've kind of
know.
like,
that's why I asked you to answer.
And my habit has always been to just sort of see, I look at this very, very simplistically, very primitively, you could say, kind of like
Naturally.
an ignoble savage. So I just see the origins of inequality as like, this is what's wrong, social contract, here's the best we can do to solve the problem. Here's how we got here. This is the best we can do to try to get someplace better. And I think that the social contract, I can't remember how he puts it early on in the text, but the idea is that you want to just, yes, it's true that everything outside of nature is going to have its disadvantages. But if you're in civil society, certainly has its disadvantages. But we can find a way to organize a society such that we maximize freedom and minimize the kind of unfreedom that he thinks is so horrific about civil society. So I see them as connected as in the more like the problem solution format. The other thing I'd say is that I think if you look at Origins of Inequality, I think the real key term there is well, I guess not term, but amor prop, I think, is central to understanding what goes wrong. And I would say that the social contract and the sort of society that he describes in that text is a way of ameliorating or minimizing the influence of amor props as much as possible. So that's the other way I would look at it. Similarly, the problem solution. But
kind of diagnosis prescription.
Absolutely, that's how I see it. Yeah.
How about you, Mauro?
So I really like the way that kind of Alec described it, because it's a very sort of, it very much follows the model that, Dan O'Neill kind of modeled for us, that Dan O'Neill himself is sort of, borrowing from kind of the work of Sheldon Wolin, right? To like think of texts of political theory as genres, right? So what kind of a genre is the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, right? Well, it's a critical one, right? It's sort of a negative dialectic, right? Like a negative inquiry into precisely these things that at the time were being kind of rethought and debated as more information came from the South Pacific, from the New World, right? These expeditions that were tied to the encyclopedia, right? The spirit of literally rethinking the foundations of what Europe claimed to be built on, given that there was difference, right? That there was otherness.
I'll tell you, Mauro, I have instructed my students to pay close attention to all those footnotes, which they rival the main body of the text in length. Yes. And the text opens with Rousseau saying, yeah, just ignore them. You don't really need to read them, which to me is the ultimate clue that they are very important. You really need to pay attention to them. And that's the stuff he's referencing in those footnotes is all the kind of data being gleaned from these.
This proto-anthropological data, right? That, and I have when we get to quotations, I'll share you my favorite quotation from the Discourse. But so if we think of the Discourse, as Alex said, as a sort of critique, right, then the social contract becomes this kind of, resolution is a tough word, but definitely becomes a sort of ideal type, right? Like, as he says, I think precisely in the chapter on the legislator, chapter 7, I think, anyone who sort of takes up this task of wanting to create a republic, a set of laws for people, needs to realize, right? Like, this is a much more difficult task than just setting up a constitution, right? So I always present these texts, or when I do present them, I present them to my students first and foremost as genres. Like, And because Rousseau comes later in the semester, so then obviously we start to draw parallels to other thinkers, right? And so, we think very much about the difference between the trial and death of Socrates and the Republic. And if we fast forward, the typical move of fast forwarding, 2000 years to Machiavelli, right? I juxtapose sort of what is it that the Prince and the Discourses on Titus Livy are doing, right? And Rousseau's not doing the exact same thing, because Machiavelli's Discourses were a much longer drawn out reflection on history and on the challenges of rule and how to revive a republic in crisis, a principality in crisis, an empire in crisis. And I've never quite made what is the thing that Rousseau is trying to revive in the social contract, right? This is also the period of time where he starts to get into fights with the people around the Encyclopedia Project. So I don't know if he's had his famous dispute with Hume yet, but it's definitely the point in his biography where he's already, I think, getting tired of Paris, which was this point that was made kind of earlier, right? And he's already fought with Diderot. He already sort of kind of thinks about what a waste the Encyclopedia Project is. And I think if I were to venture a guess, right, so in the dangerous territory of speculation here, right, in that text is sort of, we catch him at one of his most reflexive moments, right? Like maybe not quite thinking about legacy yet, but definitely trying to think of something that will represent, right, like what his kind of vision of a political utopia or a political transformation actually looks like. So he seems less angry in this text, especially when you read the two of them next to each other. But there's also something else in terms of this awareness of, I don't want to quite call it soulcraft, but I had that word kind of, jotted into mine.
Right. The idea of how to make a people, how to take a bunch of amour propre, vanity-ridden, selfish little Hobbesian individuals and turn them into a community, a people. Yeah.
And whereas the discourse is all about beating them into submission, all of a sudden the social contract is more, I don't know what we would call it, right? Like it's more about the nomos, right? It's
or
more
if
about,
not beating them into submission, I think kind of rousing them,
yes.
right? Like look at your chains,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's really hard for me because I don't dwell too much on the period, but I do dwell on genres a lot, right? I like to present to the students this way, right? What's the difference here, right? And so I find a lot more affinities between, the Machiavelli of the Discourses and the Rousseau of the social contract, for instance. And so, that's a helpful kind of way for the students to think about the challenge of both doing political theory in an applied sense and in a reflexive sense, right? That political theory isn't just about critique all the time, right? Like we do aspire to do this kind of ideal thinking work sometimes, perhaps to our detriment, but we do it anyway, right? Because we do envision the hope of a better society or a different society.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. That was helpful for me. So I'm sure it'll be helpful for my students as well. All right, so now to the question that I think we've all been waiting for, because ultimately we all got into this business, quote unquote, because we love to read. We have a great love and appreciation for language, and Rousseau is a brilliant writer. So what's your favorite passage? And I open this up to any of Rousseau's texts. It's all on the table. You don't have to stick to just the second discourse and the social contract. What's your favorite passage from Rousseau? Share it with us and tell us why you like it so much.
I'll jump.
Go ahead.
Since
I have a few. I don't know if you're going to pick mine, but let's see.
Since Dr. Dinnin hesitated there, right? So, my favorite passage, right? So he has all these wonderful, nuggets and pearls, right? Of rushing into our chains, right? Of the oppression of one class, how the trade-off between, we want our freedom, but it has to come at the cost of subjugating somebody else, right? Quotes that I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit of time. But one of my favorite quotations is right at the beginning of the preface to the discourse on the discourse on the origins of inequality. So after kind of a couple of long paragraphs where he's opening the essay, right, to these sovereign lords in this competition, right? And he has these brilliant liners on like, I would have wished to be born in a country where the sovereign and the people could have one and the same interest only. I would have wished to live and die free. I would have wished no one in the state could claim he was above the law. There's this sort of really nice passage where he says, and I'm going to quote at length now, I would not have wished to live in a newly created republic, regardless of how good its laws were, for fear that the government might not fit the exigencies of the moment. We kind of hinted at that earlier, right? either by not suiting the new citizens or they it, so that the state would not be liable to upheavals and disintegration almost from birth. And this is the one I love. For freedom is like those heavy and succulent foods or full-bodied wines that can sustain and fortify the robust constitutions that are used to them, but that overcome, ruin, and intoxicate the weak and delicate ones that are unused to them. I mean, if that doesn't capture this spirit of enlightenment, knowing yourself, and the kind of romantic sensuousness that will then evolve into these arguments about the new man, the general will, right? Like, I don't know what does.
Yeah. I love the likening to like tolerance for alcohol. You know, that's how free you can be. How much freedom can you tolerate? It's just like how much wine can you tolerate?
Yeah.
You know, I'm sitting here in my late 30s, closer to 40 than I am to 30. And I'm like, I think Rousseau's got it completely backwards. I could really handle my liquor a lot better when I was 21 than I can now. But go ahead.
Ditto.
Yeah. No, I'm glad. I had a feeling you might pick something from the Origin. So I picked Origin of Inequality. I picked something from the Social Contract, and this is from chapter 15 of book 3, which I think is a really kind of fantastic chapter. I imagine it is one that you'd be lingering on. The quote itself comes later on. I'm just going to read a couple of different snippets from this chapter, and then I'll get to the quote that I really love. So here's what he says. Says, in a well-regulated nation, this is where Rousseau is talking about deputies, representatives, and whether this would be something that would be suitable for the kind of society he's describing, which is governed by the general will. It says, in a well-regulated nation, every man hastens to the assemblies. Under a bad government, no one wants to take a step to go to them because no one feels the least interest in what is done there, since it is predictable that the general will not be dominant, and in short, because domestic concerns absorb all the individual's attention. Good laws lead men to make better ones. Bad laws lead to worse. As soon as someone says of the business of the state, "What does it matter to me?" then the state must be reckoned lost. Okay, now why? It says further down on that, a couple paragraphs later, it says, any law which the people has not ratified in person is void. It's not a law at all. The English people believes itself to be free. It's gravely mistaken. It is free only during the election of members of parliament. As soon as the members of parliament are elected, the people is enslaved, is nothing. In the brief moments of its freedom, namely when they're voting, the English people make such a use of that freedom that it deserves to lose it. And then my favorite quote, I suppose you could say, comes a little bit after this, where Rousseau says, where rights and freedom are everything, inconveniences are nothing. Which is just beautiful, right? Inconveniences are nothing. So you shouldn't be so concerned about, the time it takes, the energy it takes to participate in politics, because the good that you receive from that is to be free, to have rights. And the inconveniences that cost you, those things are so insignificant if you understand what freedom and rights really imply for human life and for a society. Of course, the part that I also think is worth reading there has to do with representative government and its relationship to freedom. And Rousseau clearly sneers upon us or upon any society that would depend upon representatives to conduct its public affairs. And the reason for that, of course, is that for him, that's a sign that the people have become obsessed with their own private interests, with luxuries, with acquiring things, accumulating wealth, so on and so forth. And therefore, they've lost any ability to see to their own freedom and its preservation. So they've lost that vigilance, which is required for freedom.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you chose that passage, Alec. It segues perfectly into my final question for you two. This is a question that we all confront no matter what text we teach from the history of political thought. It's kind of the so what question, right? Why bother reading Rousseau today? What could Rousseau possibly say that might, illuminate in a perhaps critical way aspects of our contemporary political life? Why bother? And I think that passage, right, is just such a clear example of why Rousseau can be useful today. As you were reading it, Alec, I was kind of flashing on this study that I came across. It was done in the kind of period in between the 2016 and 2020 election by the Knight Foundation. I'm trying to think of what it was called. It was like the 100 Billion Project, I think, where it was one of the first attempts to really systematically study chronic non-voters, right? So, you know, in the most recent election here in the United States, I think something like 2/3 of eligible voters voted, which is remarkable. That's record high participation, but that still means 1/3 of eligible voters did not. And so what this study attempted to do was to look at those people, right? Who is that, you know, 1/3 or more of the electorate that just chronically, persistently makes the political choice to not engage in politics? And what they found was exactly what Rousseau would have predicted, right? Why don't they participate? Because they feel like the system is rigged and corrupt, and the general will is not going to be, you know, kind of manifested there, right? It's just going to be a bunch of, you know, kind of particular wills and, you know, narrow, self-interested, ambitious people looking out for their own good and pursuing their own private gain. It has nothing to do with me. So why bother, right?
Right, which may be true, but it's also kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, you know,
Yeah.
and both at the same time, right?
Yeah. So you know, I kind of stole and answered my own question, but you guys go ahead. Like, what do you think Rousseau can do for us today? Why should we be interested in what he has to say now?
Well, since I hesitated last time, I'll go ahead. I have like a couple, so I'm going to just touch on a few, shape slightly through them. So first, I think he gives us an understanding of the motivation behind wealth and accumulation of wealth. And I think that understanding is rooted for Rousseau more in our psychological experiences and the way that we look at each other, the way we value ourselves, this kind of thing, which precedes in some ways any kind of material interest or understanding of material interest. And so I think that he in a way, I hate to say this to you know, comment in any way negatively about the primal father, Karl Marx, but I think in a way he's more compelling in the question of psychology and human psychology that underpins capitalism. So for that reason alone, I think he's worth reading. A couple of other things too, which have to do more with, well, just as an aside on that last point, I think too that he articulates the extent to which our institutions are really kind of grounded in fictions. I think that also is a common theme that runs throughout his work, that these are sort of, a lot of them are shams, but most of the kind of institutions we have are just constructions of our own. And
even the legitimate authoritative ones, right? And that chapter on the legislator that you referred to earlier, right? He says, like, look, the legislator has to like kind of found the society and then vanish and attribute it all to the handiwork of God.
Yes, speak in myth and this kind of thing.
Yeah, and civic religion is just a really important, you know, part of building this this society for Rousseau. So yeah.
Yeah, right. So the other thing I was going to say, 2 points about democracy. So on the one hand, I think, as I was kind of trying to show with that quote that I read, I think he illustrates how important it is to kind of maintain vigilance and defending democracy and preserving democracy, sustaining it, but not just vigilance, also just kind of participation and substantive, real, comprehensive, constant participation. That this is, if you're going to actually really realize democracy, it's a necessity, it's a requirement. Now, at the same time, I think that if you read Rousseau, you also get a very clear, you know, image of why some see a dark side to democracy, and especially to more full realizations of democracy than what we tend to have today. So you might call these illiberal democracies. Democracies aren't bounded by rights or anything in particular. Democracies that can just decide whatever, and you know, whatever decision occurs in the General Assembly is the kind of thing that happens, right? So absolute democracy. And he is known for this, of course, I think, especially in the aftermath of, you know, 20th century, mid-20th century experiences of totalitarianism. So he's famously, Bertrand Russell says something about how Hitler is a child of Rousseau or an outcome of Rousseau. Isaiah Berlin has this quote where he also links him to Hitler and Mussolini and says things like, I think he's called him the militant lowbrow, the greatest militant lowbrow in history. And so all these dictators, all these totalitarians are his heirs. And I think that that's all linked back to this idea I think that Rousseau has, which I mentioned previously, against freedom depends on this level of discipline and socialization, which is all encompassing. And so if you don't have that discipline, and if you don't have that kind of all-encompassing politicalization of social life, you won't be able to really realize freedom, according to Rousseau. Of course, that is something, an all-encompassing state, which is equivalent to totalitarianism. So you see why he gets sort of, he is the bridge in some ways between democracy and totalitarianism for many thinkers, theorists in the 20th century. So I think for that reason, he's also important to read. And he's hilarious. So that's the last part. Yeah.
I would only add to that, because that was actually quite profound, because I mean, you know, Alec being a great student and really kind of, you know, physician of liberalism and its critics, right, and its troubles. It's definitely a different take than I have. You know, I read Rousseau very similar. I read kind of the discourse Rousseau more, right? As Alec said, like I think of him as this kind of proto-anthropological thinker who is, in his own imperfect sort of way, trying to rethink the basis, trying to come up with a kind of a natural history of man, right? Like, you know, how did we get here, right? Which is, of course, a difficult task, not only because of the tools that he's trying to employ to do this, but also this anger, right? This deep-rooted emotion that is informing his work. That I think, in a way, we see a much, let's not call it perfect, but we see a much more refined and indeed mature version of in how Mary Wollstonecraft draws from him and is able to apply the kind of a critique to the failures of, say, the French Revolution, at the same time that she's capable of acknowledging, right? Like, what did the French Revolution achieve? What did it change, right? So I think of Rousseau more as the prophet, right, than the Messiah, if you will, right? And we can talk about that kind of tension precisely because he was such an important figure to these revolutionaries just a few decades after he pens these kind of works. But the thing I like the most to sort of kind of remind students is about that general paradox that politics presents us with. I mean, I would even dare say, if it weren't loaded with its own kind of preconceptions, right? I mean, Rousseau presents us with kind of the tragedy of politics, right? He presents us with, you know, a model of how to channel that anger, right? How to kind of really target what we may find to be the different ills around us in a systematic way, right? So not just simply say that, you know, they're awful because they're taking my freedom, but, you know, try to really present a kind of a criticism of, so what's actually going on here, right? Like, and who do the measures that curtail people's freedom actually benefit when we're thinking about them contextually? But he also has this great line in the social contract, the very end of book two, of book two, where he sort of says, right, he's describing, you know, these three different kinds of laws and relations that the legislator needs to kind of take in mind, right? Like the action of the complete body unto itself, right? Like the relation of the whole to the whole. Then he talks about the relation of the members to one another, right? Or to the body as a whole, right? And then, he talks about civil laws, right? Like in this third relation, you know, a relation between disobedience and penalties and these kinds of things. And then he ends the book two by saying, you know, along with these three kinds of laws goes a fourth, most important of all, which is graven not on tablets of marble or brass, but on the hearts of the citizens. This forms the real constitution of the state, takes on everyday new powers where other laws decay or die out, restores them or takes their place, keeps the people in the ways in which it was meant to go, and insensibly replaces authority by the force of habit. I'm speaking of morality, of custom, above all, of public opinion, a power unknown to political thinkers on which nonetheless success in everything else depends. While with this, the great legislator concerns himself in secret, though he seems to confine himself to particular regulations. For these are only the arc of the arch, while manners and morals, slower to rise, form in the end its immovable keystone. And I think, you know, and I'm not saying like, you know, like that's the secret to how we solve our political ills, but at least it exemplifies and it models the tension that many of us do feel, right? Between the kind of inner revolutionary in us and that inner little angry conservative in us that at some point maybe becomes a really loud angry conservative in us, right? And so there's something about the evolution of thinkers that I think is really interesting that I think Rousseau never let take over. You know, you hear this sort of platitude about how, you know, sometimes young people will start revolutionary and become conservative, or sometimes people will just start one way and will, you know, carry that through to the very bitter end, right? There'll be a raging leftist or a raging right-winger till the very end. And Rousseau sort of sits in that discomfort. He sits in the discomfort of, I want to change this, and at the same time, I want to create something, right? That sensibility between transformation and maintaining, right? And I like to tell students that, right? Like, I mean, think about this great moment that we have to be able to have the stability to read this, right? Like, wouldn't we want to make sure we protect some of that at the same time that we want to solve problems out there in the world?
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you both so much for taking time away from teaching your own students to share some of your insights and experiences with me and mine. It really does mean a lot to me. And then on top of that, to get together with my old grad school buds and talk about political theory, it's like I'm a Twitter. So thank you. Thank you very much. We should do this again.
Thank you, Lorna.
Yeah, thank you, Lorna. All of Dr. Bracewell's students, we must say, are very, very lucky. Very, very lucky. You work with one of the premier, perhaps the premier political theorists in Florida at the moment, but certainly in issues surrounding pornography. So.
Oh, well, thank you for saying pornography in the video. Now I'll know if they watch to the end.
As do her colleagues at Flagler College, by the way. A great joy to have Lorna as a colleague and a fellow traveler through these struggles of higher ed in our time. So yeah.
Well, thank you. It means a lot to me.